All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, good people. Welcome down the Security Rabbit Hole to yet another edition of the Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast, your favorite podcast for all the interesting cyber things and maybe some other stuff. I am Raf. You should by now know me. And I have a great episode for you today, presenting solo because James is off and doing James things. And frankly, I forgot to invite him to this one. Sorry. Logistics. It's been a bit busy. The world, as you're listening to this, is probably either at RSA conference in San Francisco or lucky they didn't get to go. This is the not RSA episode, and it's taking a different slant. I am taking this in a very interesting direction. Not a topic I thought I'd cover on the podcast, but all right, here we go. I brought Tom in for you. And Tom, before we go, introduce yourself and let's hear what you got.
Yeah, thanks, Ralph. Good to meet you. I'm Tom Venables. I'm the Enterprise Solutions Director for Turnkey Consulting, which sort of means that I tie together enterprise risk management, GRC, with cybersecurity and application security and access governance. Just trying to get some slightly more strategic solutions, reduce technical debt, and pull this together into a more secure environment. It's good to meet you.
Good. So we are going to be talking today a little about HR in cybersecurity. HR, the people everybody loves. They're everyone's favorite folks to get email from, and consequently, the folks that never party at conferences. So, Tom, you have I'll say a unique perspective. Let's hear. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I think it's a topic that's been pretty close to my heart for a while because we do a lot of access governance work as controls implementation, right? And part of the puzzle for that is having an authoritative source of identity. And that's often coming from the HR part of the organization. Who are my employees? Who are my users? What do they need access to? And so a few years ago, I started thinking about, well, why aren't CISOs closer to their HR directors and to that part of the organization? Because it is a shared accountability model, right? We're both working to try and secure the environment, secure the estate for customers. And in order to do that, you need quality data. And quality data only comes from quality processes, and quality processes can only be built on systems that support them. So thinking a little bit about that, I was trying to think about how to better build those relationships and to get some of that accountability into the HR function where I think it belongs as gatekeepers to the organization. Some of it, we like to bag on HR, right? Often the master data isn't there. They like to reorganize the organization because it's been 6 months since they last did, is sometimes how it feels. I think they get a bit of a bad rap. I think CISOs could do a better job of educating them. Right? We don't necessarily talk about what's downstream from their processes. So everything from advertising a position to evaluating the candidates, their suitability for the organization, that's part of gatekeeping our security. From that, we then create an employee record. And I don't want to talk about the wisdom of tying identity to first name, last name. But those identity records in slightly more mature organizations are then fed into downstream systems. And the impact that has isn't necessarily understood by the people who are responsible for the startup process. Which I think that gives a slightly difficult challenge to a CISO or anybody responsible for gatekeeping access to critical systems and data that is slightly incongruent with HR's attitude to security, because they're actually leading some of the conversations that we've got around data integrity, data level security, data loss prevention. They're the ones who are concerned about their records hitting the dark web. So from their own data perspective, they're having a very mature discussion around what the systems are doing to secure that and what the wider environment looks like to secure what they consider business critical data. But then when you come and say, okay, how many user IDs should we have? Who's left the organization in the last week? who's moved around the organization and needs to change their access. Those conversations become a lot more difficult.
So you've hit on a spot that's particularly interesting to me because I've lived it. I've been a benefactor of the brokenness in this piece of the HR puzzle, and that is the onboarding, offboarding, right? When you let's pull this process apart, but first let's define it. So what I mean by that is when an employee comes on board, they are given a specific job, they are assigned a specific role, they are given and provisioned, allegedly, I hear, a specific set of access to application systems, drives, tools, and data. Let's pretend that that's relatively accurate on the first go.
Yep.
Let's fast forward 3, 4, God help us, 7, 8 years, right? They've now had 3, 4 different roles.
Yep.
And now they have 3 or 4 different roles worth of access that nobody has. Like, they keep provisioning, but nobody knows how to deprovision. So provisioning is hard, right? It's gotten easier as we've gone to systems like single sign-on and federated access. But I am not convinced in the slightest that anybody has figured out how to deprovision things properly. Because even in the best systems, the best platforms, the best run companies, there are still things out there that exist outside the federated sphere. Whether it's data access application systems. Oh, hey, I needed access to this one cloud instance. A buddy gave it to me so I could get the job done, and then I forgot about it.
Yeah.
Right. I'm sure you've got some thoughts on this. So I'm gonna leave it at that because I don't want to rant, and I will if I keep talking.
No, I mean, it's the classic problem of access creep, and you could, if they were still going, talk to Barings Bank about how that works, right? It's fundamental to being able to ensure that your business can continue to operate, is that the right people have the right access at the right time. And I think it's the right time piece of that you're focusing in on.
Yeah.
I have seen mature organizations where they tie access to job descriptions, to organizational identifiers, and even, location identifiers. And, with conditional access policies now, we're a lot more able to react to things like physical location changes, organizational changes, better than we could 20 years ago when I started.
Okay.
But tying access to a job code that HR maintain should be enough. That should tell you what systems I need, what data I get access to. And if I change that job code, I should be able to take that trigger into whatever my provisioning solution is, whether I'm using an enterprise identity one or using something like Microsoft Entra or SailPoint, or others are available, of course. I should be able to identify any of my triggers, whether that's a mover or a lever. Where I see the process falling over is often that the information fed into HR by line managers, etc., is not necessarily great quality. But that's a process that needs to be fixed. And it's a process that the CISO can't fix, the application owner can't fix. The only people that really own that process are HR, and they're responsible for the training piece. And we'll come on to security and awareness training in a moment, I'm sure.
I hope not.
No. Well, how many organizations have got HR as custodians for security and awareness training because they run all the other training records?
No, it's always security. It's always security, right? Because somehow security. Once again, we're back to this. Somehow security is different. But it's an IT problem, right? Yeah, right. It's always an IT. But so let me just pull you back just a little bit, because I had an instance of this. I've used this as an example. This is probably now, I don't know, this is probably 2000, let's see, 15, 14, 13, 2013. So 10 years or so. So I'm hoping two things. One, this company has fixed this, and two, that these sorts of things can't happen anymore. I suspect they can. But here's the deal. So I went into to do a consulting gig for an organization that talked about security strategy, right? Kind of understanding and peeling back processes and where we could optimize, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Brick and mortar company being sort of dragged kicking and screaming into being a tech company, like we all are. Not kicking and screaming, but the tech company part.
Yeah.
By basically the marketplace, right? The world is taking them there. They don't want to go. So I'm sitting, and it was a fairly well-known brand at the time. So I'm sitting there in the lobby of their headquarters, in front of the guard station, right? They have one of those rent-a-guards, right? One of the few brands everybody knows. And I'm sitting there and I'm just watching people badge through. And I'm kind of like, okay, well, this seems to be a pretty well-run organization. And a guest comes in, they have to go to the front desk, they have to give their ID. The person types their information. So, you're here to see so and so. I'm like, oh, don't do that. But okay, yeah, yes, I am. Okay, great.
Yeah.
And it kind of left my brain because we had other things. And so we're sitting there. And one of the things that we talked about was access, right? One of my big pillars was access and identity. So we get to that, and we start talking about joiners, movers, and leavers, right? What you just said, the classic add, modify, remove in the provisioning of access and identity management chain.
Yeah.
And we are, and this goes on for like, I don't know, we're like 2 hours into this thing, and we discovered they have this, as you would imagine, they have a relatively new high tech at the time identity system. They have started moving things over to it, processes, all that stuff. And then there's like this, so they have these, they draw this thing, okay, you got this, it connects to this, it's this changed to that. And then there's somebody that draws this like this thing over here, it's not connected to anything. I'm like, but hold on, what's that? They're like, well, I mean, it's technically connected. So they start drawing a dotted line. I'm like, I think that's actually worse. Like, okay, what is that? And the person staying at the board says, well, so this company still has a lot of legacy, mainframes and whatnot, right?
Yeah.
And he says there are a lot of provisioning processes that are automated, but the majority of them that happen on this side are all manual. And I'm like, let's talk about that. So we spent the next hour sort of talking about how these processes are not running real time. They're running batch, and some of them are running weekly schedules. Some of them are running daily schedules and whatever. And we're getting through this. And I had just like this crazy, moment of like, hey, wait a minute. I sat at your front desk a couple hours ago, which felt like a month at that point. It's like, what about the badges? And then I happened to catch a glimpse of the CISO going, like that eye rolling back in the head, like, oh God, he did that. And so the HR person says, well, that's a batch process too. We reconcile because we have so many sites and so many people and so many disparate systems, and the way we usually onboard, offboard. He goes, onboarding is generally done on the first of the month.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, cool, that makes sense. So somebody can't join mid-month. If they do, they're going to have to be escorted by somebody for 2 weeks. All right, inconvenient, but cool. I guess, not a problem. I mean, not a huge problem. And then I'm like, wait, so what happens if you fire somebody on the 3rd of the month? She goes, what gets reconciled at the beginning of next month?
So they've got access for.
And at that point, the hamster like got a jolt of lightning and started like running really fast on the wheel in my head. And I went, hold on. Wait a minute. So if I get fired on a second and I have access to IT things, wiring closets, etc., I've got like 28 days of globally throughout your sites just kind of like wreaking havoc. And a lady looks at me and she goes, huh, yeah, I guess so. And I'm going, oh boy.
Yeah.
But I suspect that's not unique.
No, it's certainly not. I'm still working with clients who are trying to tie physical access systems to their identity systems. So they've done a lot of the digital part. You know, the system's access is being revoked. And then somebody says, well, what about the fob system? That doesn't take a feed. And all of a sudden, you know, and this is 10 years further on, it's still a challenge that organizations are trying to solve. And the location identifiers, the organizational identifiers, those are things that can help with those, not just the digital security elements, but the physical security elements that says, how are we dealing with these individuals and the access that they provide? And, you know, the fact that that card is active for 28 days, you know, if you were a malicious actor, you could sell that to somebody who's got bad intent, right?
I mean, even if you're not a malicious actor, even if you're just like, wow, they fired me, this sucks. And you're like, wait, I can get back into building for another 28 days. And sometimes it's, oh, I forgot, you know, I can go back and get my plant off my desk because my friend is my friend the plants has been there with me for years. I want to take my plant. And sometimes it's, I know where all the HR data is. I know which cabinet it's in. I'm gonna go get me some of that so I can take it to the next company. Like, I feel like that's a very real problem that as we hurtle towards automation and, you know, I think what I'm trying to say is like it's kind of like how the slug moves, right? The front part gets really, really, really far out ahead, and then the back part just slowly, then it catches up, and then the front part goes out further. I feel like this is how security operates, right? The bleeding edge of things, like where digital identity and stuff like that is relatively far out.
Yeah.
But the stuff that you and I are talking about right now, like it's at the back of the tippy back end of the slug, and it's just sort of like, yeah, all right, I'll go as slow as I can, but still be attached.
Yeah, and I mean, is that a failure on the part of the business and these processes that aren't keeping up?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and so how do we fix that? I suppose is the question that I want to be able to answer. I'm not there yet. I've been trying, but I do think a big part of that is education. You know, and we're somewhat more risk averse than most users in an organization, right? We've been doing this for a long, long time. And we understand that an identity that's sat there inactive for a couple of weeks is a gateway to malicious actors who want to access networks and do traversal across the network, plant malware, etc.
Yep.
The people responsible for the process don't necessarily know the capabilities of the attackers, right? So they think it doesn't matter if I don't revoke this. As long as it gets revoked eventually, it doesn't matter that there's a 28-day latency until the end of the month. But when you point it out, as you did in that sort of physical medium, they suddenly go, oh, hang on, the front door is wide open to somebody we've just fired. And they need to start understanding that in the digital world.
So where I struggle is that as in, I think, every security conversation, right? There's this always at some point gets back to the legacy technical debt that we carry as organizations, not security necessarily, but as security as well, but as companies, as organizations, we have technology that's not going away anytime soon, and it doesn't work with the new stuff. So you want to implement the shiny, brand new, the latest and greatest, which you should want to, and then this and that stuff becomes increasingly incompatible with the old as it gets older stuff. And so you end up with two worlds. And almost every company I've talked to, almost every company I've worked in, ends up with those two separate worlds. And you can see it right now, right? As companies, not brand new companies, but ones that have been around for 20, 15, 20, 30 years, right? Have been around for more than one turn of the technology wheel. There, as they go to things like the cloud and start deploying SaaS applications and all the like SaaS HR and all these cool things, what you realize is like their old stuff, the things that aren't going away anytime soon, right? Their manufacturing devices, their retail point of sale, those kinds of things, because they're not broken, and there's no reason to replace them. They're just not compatible with stuff that was, that's now turning, almost old enough to drink. And so, and that divide, like at some point, the vendors that make new stuff, Microsoft was faced with this, right? Well, they have to eventually say, look, that stuff's too old. We're not going to support that. And you're like, that's legitimate, but now what?
Yeah. And we've got, manufacturing clients whose entire production lines are running on Windows Server 2000 and stuff like that. So from the CISO's perspective, they're looking at that going, that's a massive vulnerability. And that's why they're not focusing on the processes around identity and around these GML processes. Because the CISO's got 1,000 different things. And one of those things is quality data to drive identity and access governance. It's also worth focusing on sort of like the wider GRC elements that HR really are responsible for. Because a lot of your sort of manual of authorities, your lines of reporting, your workflows are built on org structures, line manager information, organizational identifiers that they're responsible for. So you might have created an entire incident response plan to a breach, and it's keying off your HR structure. And it's taking an automated feed into Active Directory, and it's allocating work items, and you've built it pretty optimally. And then a restructure happens. And that feed comes in, and all of a sudden you've got orphaned workflows and items that aren't getting escalated. So from a pure like cyber incident response plan, all of that data that you need in order to identify who's accountable, who's responsible, etc., suddenly gets orphaned. And again, it's downstream data from a point of creation where they don't understand what the knock-on implications are. And I don't think they've ever been told, because IT will often integrate these systems. They'll speak to, SMEs in HR to understand what the data sources are, etc. But they won't necessarily then communicate back to HR what the implications are for changes to master data.
That's right.
So I think we're both a little bit to blame on this one. I think they could definitely be more mature. But we could do a much better job of bringing them on the journey, and they should be treated as a key stakeholder in a lot of our risk management discussions.
So talk to me, Goose. How do we get better? Is it an organizational model thing? Is it a purely process? Is it an interconnect? Like, how is HR connected to HR systems connected to is it something that cyber is missing? Is it not cyber's problem?
What do we mean by cyber? The second we mention cyber, the second we mention cyber, it's an IT problem, right? And so a business application owner or business process owner is going to say that's the CIO's job or the CISO's job or our IT function's job. A shared accountability model needs to be established. And I'm talking all the way up to the enterprise risk level sort of reporting here. So you want to reduce your cyber risk. The first point or the new perimeter is your identities. What is the source of your identities? Well, it's based on HR data. Therefore, HR have to be made accountable for that. So, I mean, I listen to the pod a lot. We talk about whose head is going to roll in the event of a breach or an incident, right?
Yeah.
Why is it not that the people responsible for the creation of that master data are clearly allocated and accountable? I've sat in a room with HR director for a very large organization, upwards of 200,000 employees, and asked the question, how many people work for this organization? And the response came back, it depends. Which I was like, well, I think there's an integer at the end of that question.
Yeah, that can't be that can't be a variable. Like, what do you mean? It depends on what specifically?
Yeah, and we drilled into that, and we got, do you mean contingent workers? Do you mean part-time workers? Do you mean third parties? And I'm like, no, I mean employees. How many people are you paying at the end of the month? And the answer came back again. It depends. And
it's not a good answer.
It really wasn't. And, it was a pretty senior level meeting where that got to the heart of the management information system we were trying to build for them. And they didn't trust the data out of it. I was like, well, you can't tell me what data you're putting into it. So, and when that sort of answer is possible, how do we effectively guard the gates? How do we stop people getting those access cards or getting them taken away? So it's definitely something that needs to go up the chain, and there needs to be accountability tied to the salaries of the directors in charge of this, right? If you want to know why an HR director is getting paid $600,000 a year, it's to take responsibility.
Yeah.
And there are cyber risks that are linked to HR need to have that sort of risk ownership discussion to say, you are responsible for this part of the puzzle and all of these downstream systems that are impacted by your decision making.
And that's fair. I'm going to say this. I think the fundamental issue that we run, again, there's a couple of things working for us and against us. Human nature is driving against us, because even in the best run companies with the health government agencies, right, hey, I need this to get my job done, people are just inclined to give you the access because you don't look like a bad person. Obviously you're employed here, so you can't be a bad person, and you just need to get a job done. So why would I prohibit you from that? It's not the challenge is, and I don't even fault people for that, because that just, it's again human nature. What I'm struggling with is, how do we do two things better? One, stop the disparate ends, the leading edge and that very, very badly trailing edge, from pulling further apart. Because the further apart they are, the more likelihood there is of a complete disconnect between them, right? Yeah. When you and that applies to, God help us, third parties. We haven't even talked about third party access, right? Which, like, forget that. Like that's a bigger problem than this, and we're not going to solve that one today. No. But we're approaching a process and people problem with technology. And while, again, I think I've probably said this about a dozen times before, and maybe a couple times on this podcast, but like, if you try to bring in automation to, quote, automate processes that are not well done manually, you're going to end up with a bad day. And I think that's what's happening, is we're bringing in cool new tech and saying, wow, this is going to solve it. Meanwhile, that cool new tech physically can't address or logically can't address some of the older problems we're dragging behind us. And it doesn't. And then we just sort of go, oh, well, then out of sight, out of mind, off we go.
Yeah, I think you've hit on one of the key problems there, is where in my dealings with the HR parts of the business, I've done quite a few HCM implementations, upgrades, etc. They are a lot less process oriented than maybe other parts of the business. So something like finance, right? General ledger accounting's been around for 2,000 years. They know what the process is to make a payment, and they can write it down and they can whiteboard it for you pretty quickly. That's a slightly more painful process when you're dealing with HR, which as a business function is still pretty young. if we go back 100 years, it wasn't enumerated as its own part of the business, right? It was a line manager responsibility. You needed to hire somebody. You might have to get approval from your boss, but then you hire them and away you go. Whereas now what we've got is this junior business process, if that's not pejorative, that they might be able to map the steps from a workflow perspective. But what they don't necessarily then do is do the same thing with the data flow perspective. And I think if we could tie those two together a little bit closer, that would allow you to show the downstream impacts that we've been talking about and bring them on board with that part of the discussion. As to how we affect that change, it's always about cost. Any risk management discussion is who is paying the price and what is that price. And that automation piece, there's actually a good return on investment here, because you are reducing the effort in all of your controls execution around user attestations and recertifications and provisioning and deprovisioning. If you can achieve that automation, it's one of the areas of security where we're, for once, not a cost center, because we can base it on data and say we can reduce your controls execution spend and your operational spend in this space by X based on user flow.
I'm just not convinced that I want cybersecurity, or AKA the CISO, to have that accountability. I just, like you keep saying I don't want the we. Like that's just something I thought we gave identity back to somebody, anybody else outside the CISO like a decade ago. I'm not eager to come take it back.
I think you're right. I think it's an outsourced problem for a lot of organizations now. They're putting it into third parties. But that carries its own, but it carries its own risks, right? And those third parties still need to base it on effective data, which means we come back to who's going to fix the inputs to the process.
Yeah. I fear that is the ever challenging problem. Look, I've said for a while that one of the least sexy problems that security and cyber have to solve is the asset question.
Don't get me started.
I think we found the slightly less sexy problem to solve just now, because there aren't a lot of people jumping out. Like this is not a talked about topic. You've got the IDSA that's out there, but that's looking at things from a technology and integrations perspective. Where's the push to make to give some visibility to this very difficult problem? That is, I don't think it's getting easier, right? No. I don't care what shiny new tech you bring me. This isn't gonna, this is not a solution tech can solve. This is a 60-40, maybe worse, people problem. And if we had more time, which we don't, we could go off and talk about third parties and how we do that. But then we just throw our hands up in the air and say, screw it, we've lost. But in a small enough company, everybody has access to everything. In a big enough company, eventually everybody has access to everything.
Yeah. What we need to be seen as is an enabler for the business process here. You're absolutely right. It's not a problem that technology can fix, and it never will be. It's fundamentally based on, it's HR, it's about people, right? But it's also about the processes that are followed. And those processes need to be more centrally owned than they are. You're quite right that there's an air gap between the CISO's part of the organization, the InfoSec part, the operations part, which, we've given identity to operations years ago, as you highlight, and then the business who are the initiators of that process, but also the customers of that process. So they need their people to gain access. I do think we're getting the push a little bit more. There's things like legal challenges around change of name. That's coming out of the US at the moment, actually. We've got a couple of people talking to us about actually being sued because the IT organization wouldn't support a name change because of the that's a little bit of a push, but as they start to focus on things like data loss prevention, as they start to take the data privacy regulations a lot more seriously, and those become more enforceable and have greater teeth, they're coming on board with the security discussions. I think it's on us to welcome them into that discussion, maybe have some difficult conversations about accountability, but then establish what those shared goals are and work together to achieve them.
Yeah, I'm. Listen, if you're listening to this podcast right now and going, no, I've solved this, or I have, at least maybe I have an approach to this, get a hold of me.
Yeah,
I want to know
well.
that there is, right. I want to know that there is hope out there somewhere that isn't just doom and gloom. Honestly, I want to know. And I think, unfortunately, on that note, we're out of time, and that's where we'll leave it. But I think there's work to be done. And I think that we need to do a lot of it. So I'm interested in seeing how it goes out.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Ralph. I mean, I was hoping to find some more solutions as well, but if anybody does get in touch with him, please let me know. Right.
All right, folks. A fascinating conversation on HR, bringing up some very old scars that apparently just don't heal. Tom, thanks for joining us, man. It's been an entertaining discussion, a slightly painful one. And like I said, if you're listening and thinking to yourself, I've got something to say on this, now's the time. Speak up. I definitely want to hear. I definitely want to hear how you solved it. Horror stories, whatever. So I think this conversation needs to continue a bit. This is not the end of it. So. All right, for myself and James, Tom, I want to thank you for joining the show, folks. I want to thank you for listening. Check us out, because this episode is available on the YouTube channel. Go check it out as it's streamed. Now with 100% more real faces. Nothing AI generated here, or are we? Anyway, thanks for listening. We'll catch you guys another time, another place, on another Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast.